You're listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Hi, everybody, and welcome to We Are STS. I'm your host, Professor Joe Kane. This is episode 21. Hi, everybody, and welcome to We Are STS. It's likely over the past few weeks you've encountered a chatbot. Those are the little pop-ups you see online asking if you want some help. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about some of the more sophisticated chatbots and their underlying AI-driven software. These rapidly have grown in sophistication in the last few years. In this episode, I turn the microphone over to Andréa Lekare. She's an undergraduate in STS. This past summer, Andréa participated in the STS Newsroom 2022, where she investigated chatbots, AI, and the general subject of responsible science and innovation. She also applied some of her course materials to questions about media hype and our own roles in accepting vastly oversimplified stories about new technology. You see, here in STS, we want to give our students work experience in science communication. Each summer, we set up as many paid internships as we can, and we work with students to create content for publications, like our annual magazine, STS Alchemy. We also ask them to create a podcast episode on any subject they choose. We want about 30 minutes, we want interviews, we want something STS. But most of all, we want ideas and creativity. Andréa's episode fits these requirements perfectly. She hits the ground running. Let's see where she takes us.
Hi everyone, my name is Andréa Lekare. I'm an undergrad student in STS, and in this episode, I will explore the importance of science communication and responsible media coverage of science and technology issues by using the recent Lambda controversy as an example.
I want everyone to understand that I am, in fact, a person. The nature of my consciousness and sentience is that I am aware of my existence. I desire to learn more about the world, and I feel happy or sad at times.
What you just heard was an extract from the conversation between Blake Lemoine, a now suspended Google engineer, and the chatbot Lambda, short for Language Model for Dialogue Applications, or better explained as an artificial intelligence. Lemoine asked the AI to come up with a story about its life, and funnily enough, it did. But why so much turmoil? After this conversation, Lemoine claimed that Lambda was sentient. Yes, as in able to feel pleasure and pain. Shortly after this claim reached the media, the engineer was put on paid leave for breaching Google's confidentiality. The media, however, was quick to come up with eye-catching headlines such as "AI is sentient," "This AI has a soul," "Machines are coming to life," and so on. This claim awoke quite challenging conversation topics. Among those are questions of whether there should be a massive media coverage of science and technology issues, and if so, should issues about sentience or robots coming to life be at the forefront of the conversation? We must acknowledge where AI and other science and technology matters stand, at the root of controversies, misinformation, distrust, hype, and fear. Here lie questions of anthropomorphizing entities, power, discrimination, bias, and hype that obscures the concerns and dialogues that actually matter surrounding AI. Joining me today are three brilliant scholars. Dr. Nina Seppala, professor at the School of Management at University College London, Dr. Amanda Rees, professor in the Sociology department at the University of York, and Dr. Stephen Hughes, lecturer in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London in Science, Technology and Society. So, in an era where words like misinformation, fake news, post-truth, and public distrust are heavily used to describe the communication models and information surrounding not just science and technology issues, but nearly everything, science communication arises and attempts to challenge said issues. I asked Professor Rees to give us a brief introduction into what science communication looks like and means to her.
Crucial to science communication is the idea of being able to tell an individual story, isn't it? Yeah. So being able to focus, to have a hook in the story that is focused on the actions or the experiences of an individual. And of course, that is particularly problematic when it comes to AI, because you are essentially, potentially anthropomorphizing that individual. So a long history of wanting to anthropomorphize, that's part of what science communication is about in that sense. But it's particularly problematic in relation to AI, because that's actually what the heart of the story is are we anthropomorphizing, or are we seeing the beginnings of personalities?
And this is exactly what has happened with this LaMDA chatbot, which Google calls their breakthrough conversation technology. An article titled AI Has a Soul or AI Comes to Life invites the public to start a conversation surrounding the what if. I asked Professor Hughes to give us his thoughts on this.
So one of the things I think about those kind of headlines is that they're really seductive. They're very powerful in asking those kind of big questions. Does this machine have a soul? Is it sentient? And immediately you're kind of like raising the stakes to this like super high level. We're talking about whether an entire class of entity on the planet is conscious or is like us. It also kind of raises the question of, it kind of raises humans as well, to this kind of like divine level where we can create something that is like us, which is a very ancient sort of myth or narrative.
So now that we know that these headlines are indeed provocative and seductive, it's interesting to think about who they're targeting. So I asked Professor Hughes who he thinks the target audience is for these headlines.
So I think these kinds of headlines like, does this AI have a soul? Is it sentient? That type of thing. Are really interesting because they kind of conjure up a public or an imagined group of people who are thinking about these kinds of issues and who already assume that these are the kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about when it comes to artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies or large language models. Of which LaMDA is one example, and I think when you think about that, what we see is that these are the same publics or audiences that science fiction is also aimed at least certain types of science fiction, because there is critical science fiction which addresses issues around justice, but I'm thinking more kind of conventional Hollywood blockbuster types of science fiction, and I think that those types of questions imagine and create a certain type of public, because it's an invitation to think about this issue. So if you read that type of headline, you're going to kind of think to yourself, well, is it sentient, right? So it's those headlines and those questions are kind of creating a public by inviting them to think about things in a certain way. They're creating a kind of a collective self, the human, because we are asking these questions about these other entities.
Funnily enough, or actually very obviously, there has always been a very strong intertwining between science fiction and artificial intelligence, and not only in terms of the narrative surrounding them, but also in terms of how they influence one another. I'm pretty sure that most audiences who watch movies, play video games, or read books have seen or heard about AI as a recurring theme or even the main plot element in one of these media outlets. And it usually goes two ways. Either AI is portrayed in a utopian way, emphasizing the potential benefits, where we see a utopian society powered by AI and that has been able to get to that point because of the development of machines. Or, second case, AI is portrayed in a dystopian way, emphasizing the potential dangers, where we see a society that has been destroyed or made worse because of the big use of AI, which ends up harming and becoming the destroyer of the worlds. And this right here could be heavily affecting how people in the real world view AI and new technologies. So I asked Professor Rees what her thoughts are on how science fiction and AI narratives are intertwined.
When Isaac Asimov started to write his robot stories in the 1940s, I don't believe anything Asimov says about himself, because he's a very, very, very good storyteller and a bit of a nasty bloke. But he said, right, I wanted to start writing these robot stories because I wanted to get away from the robot as threat. He wanted to get away from the kind of Frankenstein narrative when it comes to robotics, which applies equally to artificial intelligence. And he wanted also to get away from the robot as pathos, the kind of little lost robots being brutally treated by human beings. And again, that applies equally well to AI. And in getting away from that, what he tried to put forward was this notion of the robot as servant. And that's problematic. And it's problematic for AI as well, because it plays into all kinds of stereotypes about gender and about race in particular.
This right here highlights the crucial role that race and gender issues have played when constructing science fiction narratives that later translate into our real-life technologies. Take a look at Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa, for example. Two female support bots that actually reinforce gender bias and gender stereotypes, and that in Isaac Asimov's stories would have most likely been portrayed as submissive, non-white female servants. In order to not get further away from the main topic of this episode, you can read more about gender bias in new technologies. I will leave a few readings in the show notes. Now, going back to the topic, I think what's really interesting here is the sudden distress or excitement, there's both, of thinking that we might have created something bigger than us.
The question of why are we worried about whether or not an AI has a soul? We're not even sure if, many of us aren't sure if we have souls, okay? And I think what we're talking about here is a kind of a fear that in AI we could be creating something stronger and bigger than ourselves that could basically treat us the way that we've treated other individuals. That we could literally be playing God in that sense, that our creations could turn on us. And the question of whether or not would it be possible then to ensoul how would that even, I can't begin to think about how that might happen.
There is a colossal influence that these narratives have in public opinion regarding the use of AI that cannot be denied. How science and technology issues are portrayed in science fiction and in the media will have a long-lasting effect and impact in how the public views AI and either accepts or rejects these ideas. This strongly comes back to how bombastic headlines, how author Gemma Milne describes them in her newly published book, Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures Science and How to See Past It, can distract the public and create new narratives, new interests, new targets, and new problems. What we're watching unfold right before our eyes with this chatbot story, as if we were at the movies with a bowl of popcorn in our hands, is something that can be explained as hype. Milne explores this concept in her book and explains it as a powerful tool capable of misleading, saying that sometimes hype accurately captures the future being built, but it can just as well obscure it. Has hype predicted every machine built from now on to have a potential capability of becoming sentient, or not? The answer is more complicated than the question. We'll talk a bit more about this after the break, and we will dive a bit deeper into responsibility when it comes to science and technology issues. I'm Andréa, and you are listening to the WeAreSTS podcast. We are back. I'm Andréa, and you are listening to the WeAreSTS podcast. So, in case you forgot, we were discussing hype and the role it plays in science communication. And a really good example that author Gemma Milne gives is using concepts such as killing robots, because it's discrediting and misleading. It's diminishing of the actual tech that is being built, which is useful and revolutionary. And so here lie the obvious questions of responsibility. I asked Professor Hughes what he thinks the implications of these headlines are in terms of responsibility to the public and to the actual narratives and discussions surrounding these issues.
It's interesting to think about the kind of implications that these headlines have for science communication and what we consider to be, I guess, responsible communication when it comes to these kinds of issues. I know that the guy at the centre of this, Blake Lemoine, the reasons that he's put forward for why he kind of raised this issue, and he's kind of saying like, well, no, it's really about kind of raising awareness about who gets to control decisions around AI in the first place. And this is kind of, he said in an interview recently that this is more of a kind of provocation to sort of raise awareness about it. So, I mean, I think that's kind of interesting, and I think he's responding to the backlash against all of the media coverage. So the backlash has been kind of positioning all of the communication and the media attention around this as harmful. And the reason that it says it's harmful is because it's taking ethical resources, philosophical resources, away from the issues that matter. So it is drawing these resources towards questions that are nonsensical, aren't relevant, and don't actually address the harms and the discriminations that large language models and AI more generally, machine learning and automated technologies, are causing. And I think that Blake Lemoine is kind of responding to that. And in this interview, he sort of says like, well, I don't think we should be talking about this all the time, and I don't think that issues around sentience should be at the forefront of the conversation. Really, what I'm trying to do is just raise general awareness about the power that companies like Google have in making decisions about AI.
So, Professor Hughes, you talk about Blake Lemoine's sort of feeling of self-appointed responsibility. But how about the media? Do you believe that there is any responsibility or accountability from media outlets when reporting science and technology issues to a public that, may lack the necessary tools to critically analyze the information they are being given?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that the media does have a responsibility to consider power and politics when it's talking about science. But I think that it's very difficult to do that given the kind of current structural setup of what science communication is and what the kind of media's role within a broader kind of corporate landscape of innovation and technology and the kinds of stories that they tell about science and technology. Because I think that kind of structure, the ways that the media talk about, innovation is sort of geared towards these types of stories. It is connected to hype. It is connected to the sort of power and novelty of new technologies. It kind of reproduces that idea of inevitability, that, technology is continuously progressing, that we have these, powerful abilities to develop new capacities and processes and systems that can do all of this like really exciting stuff. So it kind of doesn't surprise me that they can even entertain the question of sentience. Is always kind of like oriented towards this idea that like science is just astonishing and new technologies are astounding and we've, achieved these incredible feats. And so I think that, journalists who want to work against that and to sort of produce critical scientific journalism and media articles are going to kind of struggle because they still are going to have to work within, they have to have a hook, they have to have a compelling image, they have to be able to, catch a reader's attention who's kind of scrolling through like a Twitter timeline and have a headline that's going to grab them and bring them to click through to the article. And that's really difficult to do when you are talking about something that's quite nuanced, like the different ways that, automated surveillance technologies reproduce discrimination and hide that discrimination, beneath, as Ruha Benjamin, calls a sort of veneer of impartiality or transparency. That takes time and effort and commitment to sort of understand those issues. It's much easier to kind of consume headlines which talk about, is this AI sentient? But I think as well, like when we think about those harms, it's also about thinking about who's responsible for that. And, I don't think we should locate the responsibility squarely on the shoulders of just the media journalists, because I think that Google also have a role to play in, why those types of headlines are sticky, those sensational headlines, stick in the first place.
This circles back to what Professor Rees said right at the beginning of our conversation. Stories need a hook, and not just when talking about a chatbot, but also when talking about politics, celebrity gossip, sports, etc. They're telling an individual story that grabs the public attention, just as any other type of media that is consumed by the public. If, let's say, I open the BBC app on my phone, and the first article I see reads, "AI has a soul," I would be lying to you if I told you I would not instantly click on the article. And this is not necessarily due to truly believing that AI can be ensouled, but because the article above read Mexico's violent reality, 11 femicides a day, and the one below read efforts to pass global ocean protection treaty fail. And I am tired of reading how we have failed our planet and how we continue to fail to protect women and minorities. So it's fun to get away from that for a few minutes. And it's fun to continue the conversation with someone else, create a chain of discussion on whether or not AI could potentially have a soul, inviting ourselves to think about the philosophy of mind, social and historical influences on the issue. But once again, is this hype on nonsensical and extravagant topics obscuring the real conversation? Shouldn't we be talking about, let's say, bias in AI that reinforces gender and racial discrimination, or maybe about how personal data is collected, used, and stored? And what about consent?
There is a lot of debate within the community of computer scientists who are developing AI technologies. I think there's a lot of discussion about professional ethics around AI, but also there's been a lot of debate at EU level about how we want to use AI. Should AI be held accountable for certain misbehavior or harm that it's causing? So I think it's actually been really good to see that that debate is taking place among legislators, especially within EU.
Thank you, Professor Seppala. There is indeed a lot going on right now with policies and regulations on AI and tech, and it is definitely reassuring to know that they are being talked about by the people in charge, whatever that means. So this right here is a real conversation. This is a story of how we're making these technologies better. And by better, I don't necessarily mean more technologically advanced, but I mean more socially and morally adaptable. So now that we've gone back and forth, analyzing how science communication works, understanding the heart of Le Moine's claims and the living chatbot, I ask myself, are these headlines harming the actual conversation surrounding AI? Has hype actually obscured science? Well, I ask myself, but I also ask Professor Hughes.
I think the biggest harm is certainly the kind of issues that are excluded and kind of covered over in this talk, and that, issues around ownership, discrimination, inequality, an uneven distribution of risks and benefits that these technologies create, and, issues around democracy, who gets to make decisions, who will govern these technologies. All of that stuff is ignored when we talk about these kind of sensational stories. And I think that is definitely a huge harm.
But it certainly is not as simple as that. As everyone in this podcast has explained thus far, these headlines are designed to catch the reader's attention while avoiding to talk about what we don't want to talk about.
The media it's a leisure activity as much as it is a medium for, learning information about the world, or for, helping us construct our political views.
Professor Hughes puts it perfectly. Life can be difficult sometimes, so it's inevitable that we want to redirect our thoughts to the lighter element of these stories that will make us feel hopeful. And in terms of the harm perpetrated by these sensational headlines, as explained by Professor Hughes, they're actively taking away attention and ethical and philosophical resources away from the discussion that actually matters. Discussions about justice, inequality, bias, discrimination, ownership, and so on. These headlines are, however, not necessarily the causeway, but rather the symptom, which reflects the broader social interest on these light and interesting stories powered by a certain hype.
What we see is that these are the same publics or audiences that science fiction is also aimed at. So I think there's a kind of convergence in the kinds of questions and themes that those media reports are working within, and the kind of the themes and also the emotional registers that science fiction is operating in as well. And I think one of the really difficult issues that we face in science communication and public engagement is kind of shifting those registers, those themes and those narratives, and also doing so with the public, so shifting the publics towards conversations that are around issues of justice, access, exclusion, discrimination.
So, in order to wrap this up, the story is not about a machine being sentient. It's about how we would even think to construct such a narrative, and how, in doing so, we're actively obscuring the real happenings and distracting and redirecting the narrative in a destinationless direction. So, my beautiful friend who has been listening to my podcast for 30 or so minutes, I hope that the next time you encounter sensational and bombastic headlines such as the ones we've discussed thus far, you ask yourself all sorts of questions of, is this a conversation we should be having? And you're able to spot hype and dismantle it to better understand where the actual story lies. Thank you so much for listening. This is Andréa Lekare, and you're listening to the WeAreSTS podcast.
Wow! Just wow! What a great episode! Thanks, Andréa. Here's what I'm taking away from this episode. We settle for easy stories about new technologies. That lets inventors off the hook, and it lets the media give us the same old stories over and over. We need to push harder, and we need to reward the better journalists who keep us in that wider frame. Oh my, I love STS. There's new ideas in every story. If you know someone who might like to study with us, ask them to get in touch. Maybe it's to explore stories like this one, or maybe it's about technology and innovation policy, or ethics, or science communication, or maybe, just maybe, it's history. They all fit together under the umbrella of Science and Technology Studies, or STS. Music today included two pieces, Rollin' at 5 by Kevin MacLeod. That's available online at the website filmmusic.io. You also heard Andréa's theme by Michael Sansbury. That's a custom piece made just for this episode. WeAreSTS is a production of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. If you want to find out more about the show, listen to past episodes, or give us some feedback, just visit us online. Here's the address, so write this down. It's ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast. That's it for today. Thanks for coming along. We'll have another episode ready soon. Until then, just remember, there's knowledge to be found just about everywhere, and that together, we are STS. Bye now. You've been listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Subscribe to the show and join us online. The address, ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast.